So I'm going to give a quick intro of the session, and then I'll allow my esteemed panelists to introduce themselves before we get into the questions. So last year, the chairman of the SEC said the SEC has a new role in regulating cybersecurity. And very soon after he made that statement, they released a proposal of a rule that is probably going to go into effect within the next 30 days or so. Don't ask us the exact date. But anyway, that rule contains a couple of key things. One is that all publicly traded companies would need to report cybersecurity incidents within 4 days. And we'll talk a little bit about when exactly you would need to report. And the other thing that it says is that all publicly traded companies would need a board member who is considered a cybersecurity expert. We're going to talk a little bit today about what it means to be a cybersecurity expert, of what the SEC might consider that to be. So that's what the session is going to be about. I'll hand it over to Matt to introduce himself.
Great, thanks Andrew. So I'm Matt Modica. I am the Chief Information Security Officer for BJC Healthcare. We're a regional healthcare system in Missouri and Illinois. Just to give you an idea of scale and scope, so we have 14 hospitals, 200 clinics and acute care facilities, about 32,000 employees, 50,000 users, so a pretty large provider organization. We are a nonprofit, so I'm trying to bring that aspect into, even though this is a regulation that is focused on publicly traded companies, there's still potential impact in the private industry.
I'm Erica Wilson, VP of Global Security and Privacy Risk Management for Reinsurance Group of America. We're a global organization. We reinsure and provide services and products for life and health insurance providers. And we're based in St. Louis, headquartered in St. Louis. I've been in cyber for a very long time. Most of my experience is in financial services, so very interested in this topic today as it aligns with a lot of regulations that we've seen evolving over the past several years.
I'm Alan Berry. I'm the CISO at Centene Corporation, also based in the St. Louis area, and we are a healthcare insurance company, primarily government-sponsored healthcare, so Medicare, Medicaid, and the marketplace. And we have about 27 million members on the ISH, so somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 in 15 Americans get their insurance through us. And we like to say that we're the largest healthcare company you've never heard of, because we don't market plans as Centene. You'll see us marketed as Ambetter or WellCare or other names like that, and at the state level, different companies.
All right, thanks folks. So let's get into the area of reporting. So the first question I have, and I'm going to start with Erica on this one, what do you think is going to be considered a reportable incident? And what would be considered material in terms of a reportable incident?
Yeah, this is a great question, because what is going to end up happening is every organization will have to determine what materiality impact means to their bottom line. And so with that, there's going to be a requirement probably to develop a process and a standard way for determining what that means. And that will have to be reported. I think right now we're looking at within 4 working days, within 4 business days. And I think one of the things that they wanted to highlight through this regulation is things that impact shareholder value. So in the event that an incident, even early on, is pointing to the fact that there's going to be a material amount of money that you have to either pay out through legal fees, through all the litigation, the reputational components that come with it. Those are the things that are going to be of concern to the shareholder, and so ultimately those things are going to be expected to be reported. And then there's going to be that gray area where you don't know right in the beginning, does this fit? Is it going to be? And the signs aren't there telling you whether or not it will be. And that's where some discretion and judgment is going to have to be put into place. But again, I think having a documented way to determine materiality is going to be the key.
Okay, Alan?
Yeah, and determining materiality, I think, is going to be one of the challenges here. The SEC is not real specific in this. They like to say things like something that the shareholders would be interested in. That's not real helpful. If you talk to an external auditor, they might say 1% of revenue. Well, we're a $144 billion company, so $1.4 billion has to be the cost before it's material. I don't think that's the right measure either. You talk to a CFO, they might talk in earnings per share. So if it's 5 cents per share earnings impact, it's material. Well, that's going to be a much lower number. So determining materiality is going to be a tough challenge here. And it's also a movable bar. 4 days after materiality determination, you have to report it. But it doesn't say how far apart from the incident starting or even discovered to materiality determination. So there's a lot of maneuver room for companies. I think most of us would welcome a little clearer rules and understanding on this as the CISOs that have to do the work and report this. But we really don't know where it's going to go until the final rules come out and until there's a track record, a history. What I really fear, Andrew, is that the SEC is going to reserve the right to judge our decisions after the fact without telling us what the rules are.
Yep. Matt, what do you think?
Well, from my perspective, I think a couple things. One, healthcare is already fairly regulated. We have the HIPAA rules and privacy regulations. There's some very specific timelines associated with that as far as notification of breach or potential breach. We typically take a very conservative approach when it comes to that, right? But again, it kind of points to what's the risk tolerance of the organization, what is your definition of materiality. The other pieces that I kind of worry about is what does this do in conjunction with all of the other rules, regulations, and laws that are on the books or getting ready to come out, right? So think of state of Illinois and some of the biometric rules and privacy regulations they have. I think about some of the other state regulations that are coming out as well. And so it's going to be difficult for organizations, I think, to understand where is that high watermark and where to be to ultimately do the right thing at the end of the day, and focus on how to get recovered and how to get remediation ultimately. So I would say that the last piece is really around the combination of how do you what do we do from a public-private partnership perspective, right? So from an FBI, CISA, Secret Service, et cetera, they are all pushing as well to say how can we share information and how can we share actionable intelligence back and forth across private-public industry. And I think, if people are going to have to report this on their filings and formal procedures, it might potentially impact some of that. So I think it's going to be interesting and a careful way we're going to have to navigate on what this really means ultimately.
Thank you for bringing up that government partnership bit. That leads me to the next question, which is really about how will the SEC, who's not a cybersecurity organization, how will they be protecting the data? Because just like your insurance policy is a map for attackers of how much they can ask for ransomware, we've seen cases of attackers getting data from SEC third parties and then using that to do kind of insider trading stuff. So how are they going to protect this? And what do you think about that in terms of sharing that type of information with a non-security organization? Alan, you want to start?
Sure. So this is kind of a scary element to this. All indications are we're going to report this on an 8K, which almost immediately goes on the public website for all the world to see. So if it's 4 days after materiality, if that was a really short timeline, we're likely still defending against the event. We're not done. It's rare when you clean these all up and it's all locked up in 4 days. And we don't know yet what the information has to be in the 8K. If it literally has to be this exploit was leveraged on these servers using this CVE that hadn't been patched or something along those lines, then you just gave a roadmap to other attackers. And that's not in the best interest of the shareholders, which is the whole premise of these rules, to be in the best interest of the shareholders. So I'm really hopeful that when we're all said and done, we have some parallels to the area that Matt and I work in healthcare, where we have to report HIPAA breaches to CMS and the Office of Civil Rights, but we have categories. We don't put the details in the public notification. It just says, there was a mailing error, there was an IT error, things along those lines. So it's very high level, and it's a notification that this happened, but it's not an attack path, because there's no indication that the SEC will protect this data in any way, shape, or form It's all going on the public website.
Yeah, Erica?
Yeah, I'll just say to that, I think it is a huge concern in terms of what data and information will have to be disclosed directly to the SEC, where they're going to house it, how often do you have to provide updates. It's certainly going to be an administrative task for teams to follow, whether it's your legal or compliance teams. But then just as you said, Alan, when you start disclosing details, right, many companies have 10Ks and 8Ks already. It just really becomes a matter of how they're written and how much information you give. It certainly could be something that attackers could use to gain more intel about an organization and maybe where their blind spots are. So I really am interested to see what the SEC will exactly require in terms of, you know, how general you can be in terms of what happened, or do you have to be very specific, because it could be very concerning. And then not only that, shareholders who may or may not truly understand that, it could just cause an uptick of inquiries and questions to manage it. And I can just see the overhead of, you know, oversharing or sharing too soon when you don't have all the answers is continuing to be a concern.
Yeah. Matt?
I'm happy to be in nonprofit and private industry. So, no, yes, I am. But I would say, you know, from my perspective, we're watching it closely, right? So the regulation is not going to be applicable to private industry technically, right? Or nonprofit and folks that are not in publicly traded organizations. And so we're kind of monitoring it and trying to figure out, again, what's the right thing to do as a nonprofit. And our mission is ultimately to make the lives of our patients and our community better, right? And that is our focus, right? And that extends to cyber and making sure that we are as transparent as we can be, that we're as quickly, we notify as quickly as possible if we have an issue, and then ultimately try to help those folks get back to square one or get back to some sort of equity around that. And so, you know, I think it's kind of part and parcel to what we do. We have a desire to be transparent. It'll be interesting to watch again, just to kind of see where do things fall out.
So let's dig a little deeper into that transparency thing. So in some of the other regulations where you're required to report, some people report absolutely everything and some people report very little. And so how do you think this is going to play out in terms of kind of hiding in the noise versus really reporting the things that are material and would be of interest to shareholders? Erica, you want to start with this one?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a difficult process. And I think what tends to happen with a lot of these regulations and new laws is, you know, most of us, hopefully, we kind of sit back and see who are the first violators and we learn from it. I mean, that's truly where most of us gain, okay, here's where we need to go back and refine some things. But it really is going to be difficult without having the details in terms of what they really want to know and what has to be disclosed. I think the other component to it is, you know, when you think about just an everyday shareholder, right, and they correlate value to just profit loss, right, just bottom line, it certainly can impact the economy, right? So you think about it in that way, and even companies that are very sustainable and have a great strategic view of what they're working towards, they could have a bump in the road. And so I think that particular impact to organizations could kind of trickle down and impact the economy as well.
Okay. Alan, Matt?
So one of my biggest fears is the hiding in the noise factor. If the rules are either unclear or overly, you know, penalty filled, then there's an incentive for companies to either report absolutely nothing and do their best to hide and just roll the dice, or start reporting every single ping, sweep, and scan on an 8K so that they're just flooding the site and you can't find anything real. And that's not helpful. I think all of us in the profession would welcome responsible disclosure rules and procedures that we could use for the common defense. But if they make it to where it's too much of a penalty on companies, then they're going to find ways to hide. And it's just human nature, because you don't want to affect shareholders, you don't want to affect, you know, the board. So we've got to have some clear rules, and there's not a lot of agreement, just not in the SEC, but FTC, and the FCC, the three primary independent regulators in our government, they don't agree on how to do this. And none of them are really subject to CIRCIA that is still developing their rules. So there's a coalition of the unwilling forming, and we just don't really know where it's going to work out.
Yeah. Matt, any thoughts on that?
Not much to add. I mean, I think my most respectful interpretation of the rule is really, the intent is good, right? The intent is let's share information, let's make cybersecurity transparent to shareholders, to folks that are interested in those organizations. They have a right to know, right? They have a right to know how effective we're managing security. But I do fear with some of the potential hiding tactics and things like that, and some of the negative consequences that might be associated with it. But we'll continue to kind of watch and do the right thing ultimately, what makes sense.
Okay, so last question on the reporting side. We talked a couple of times about materiality. So give me your thoughts on cyber insurance and how that plays into the materiality. Alan was talking about percentage of revenue. Matt, let's go to you first on that one. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so there's various tactics to how you deal with insurance, right? We're lucky that we have a good insurance plan and organizations that we work with. And I'll just be frank, a lot of times we will over-report, right? So we will, if we have an inkling that something might be turning into something bigger, we're notifying that broker, we're notifying the primary on that, and opening a claim, and or at least discussing it to say that what makes sense. So we're probably one of the, I don't know if we're in the minority or majority around that, but again, it's really in that whole perspective of we want to be as transparent as possible. Again, as a nonprofit, we're not here to make a ton of profit. We're here to be there for the community. Our entire bread and butter is brand and reputation, right? And so we need to be very careful in how we are treating people's data and making sure that we're doing it to the best of our ability. So I think that it's, that's how we deal with it. I don't know, others?
Yeah, so my thoughts on that, certainly with the way cyber insurance has been trending in terms of being less willing to provide the coverage, or it's becoming more stringent to have certain levels of coverage, I do think there will be a correlation, because at the moment you're not covered or you're not fully covered. That certainly could be an indicator of materiality. And I think the insurers are going to have somewhat of a say as well as you're making your claims on, reporting it. They'll probably be more proactive in wanting companies to report as well. So I think there'll definitely be some correlation. What my fear is the way the trends are with the insurance industry, we're going to kind of lose sight of having the coverage to determine the materiality. I just think it's going to continue to dwindle.
Now let's think of a hypothetical that your company has a $100 million insurance policy for this, and an event happens that's fully covered. You're not going to have any, that was an act of war, or any of that other stuff. Your withhold's $10 million. Your total damages are 60 when you're all said and done. So your real cost out of pocket is 10 million for your withhold, and you got reimbursed 50. 10 million, is that material if you're a multi-billion-dollar company? So do you have to report it? Or is it really the cost, regardless of your insurance payout, that determines that decision point? And how does that play into the equation? There's a lot of room in here for companies to make decisions. Again, to the first point, the SEC is going to judge us after the fact. And I really liked your comment about we want to wait and see the first people that have to go through it and see what happens. And we just hope it's not us. We hope we learn from somebody else. That's sad to say, but that is the truth. We don't have a long history like we do with Sarbanes-Oxley rules, like we do with the financial space, the gap reporting for your finances. There's no real rules or history or even habits to fall back on in this space. So this is going to be discovery learning for all of us.
Okay. Folks, we're about to move on to the board section, but any final thoughts on the reporting piece, anything that we haven't talked about before we move on from any of you?
Yeah, the one thing I'll add, and hopefully, right, in terms of best practices in cyber hygiene, make sure you're going back to refine your incident response plans to account for the decision around reporting and pulling in compliance and legal teams to help develop and determine what that will be, so there at least could be some level of consistency, and that you've documented to show that you're considering it. I think that's going to be huge, and although it may not save you all the time, I think it goes a long way when you show that you've been proactive and you've made those revisions. So that would be my final takeaway on that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I was going to mention something very similar, and I think that's critical. And I'd say the documentation component, to your point of, hey, we may not have clarity of what the SEC requires or what someone else requires, but we are going to make a management decision to say, this is how we're going to deal with these scenarios. And we're going to document that, and sure, somebody can come back and take a look at that later, an armchair quarterback, but at least we have a documented process that we can come back to say, this is what we thought at the time, right?
Yeah, and it's not our role to determine materiality.
Right.
So make sure, if you're a security professional, they're not leaving that on your doorstep. That is a CFO, CEO role. We help them. We supply information they need to make a decision. But at the end of the day, make sure it's really clear that's not you as the security professional that's making that decision. That belongs to the CEO and CFO.
All right, let's talk a little bit about this board expertise part of the ruling or the proposal. So first question, and it's a big one. Why do boards need cybersecurity expertise today? What's going wrong? And you can go read all the things about the FTC and Drizzly and all kinds of other rulings that have happened recently. Why do boards need a cybersecurity expertise today? Erica, you want to start with this one?
Sure. So I would just say, all of us in this industry, no matter how long you've been in it, you've seen how cyber risk have impacted organizations, both big and small, across all industries. No one is optional to something happening in the cyberspace. And so because of that, cyber risk management is just as important as financial risk management, and some of the other areas that companies have traditionally focused on. And there has to be oversight at the board level, and the proper governance and guidance, so that teams know that they're accountable for delivering on certain strategies to prevent and mitigate certain risks. So I think it's important that it starts at the top, and so that's why you need that level of knowledge and expertise, just as you do on the financial component and the finance side.
Okay, Alan?
Yeah, I would struggle with any company that doesn't think their cyber risk is in their top 5 or top 3 risks as a company. I really would. If you do a decent job of looking at your risk and making the proper kinds of assessments, qualitative and quantitative, and it doesn't fall in that top 5, then you're in a very strange space, and I'd love to talk to you and learn more. So being a top 5 risk for your company, how is it the executive management and the board should ever not be cyber literate? It just has to be. Financial risks, they understand. There's a long history of having the right kind of board members that understand financial risks. Cyber risk is there, and they have to learn to understand it and deal with it and not require too much handholding.
Matt, what do you think?
Well, I think my colleague said it pretty well, right? I think the typical history of board members, right? A typical role of a board member or director is really that business focus, that business advisement of, are we doing the right thing? Are we taking the right risks, right? Are they armed with enough information to be able to make some of those decisions? And that's the key point, right? It's our responsibility as CISOs or as executive members of the management team to articulate and articulate and quantify that risk ultimately. And it's to say, hey, here's the why we're making the decisions we're making. What advice do you have? What other thoughts do you have around that to help validate and make sure that those decisions are accurate, that we are taking the risk that we should? We all know we're never going to fix 100% of everything. So how do we, it's very important to focus and prioritize and make sure we have alignment all the way through the board to do that.
So let's just flip that question a little bit and ask it in the negative perspective. What's the risk to a company that doesn't follow this SEC ruling and does not have a cybersecurity expert as part of their board, or someone who's a fake cybersecurity expert, if you will, who claims that they have it but they really don't? Alan, you want to take that?
Activist shareholder involvement, lawsuits, malfeasance type lawsuits, misrepresentation of your facts. If you don't have proper cyber experience on your board and then you do have a breach, then the board is going to be called into question on whether they fulfilled their duties as board members. And that's going to open up the door for all kinds of lawsuits and other actions. And like we saw recently with the CEO at Drizzly, and we've seen with a couple other instances, agencies coming after that company. And that CEO, that follows him for 10 years because they deemed he was credibly responsible and failed in his duties. What's to say that's not going to follow a board member?
Exactly.
So they need to be ready.
Matt?
Nothing really to add, right? I mean, I would just say the last thing I forgot to mention before is accountability, and I think Erica may have mentioned that briefly. But it's important for someone to hold me accountable as a cybersecurity professional at the end of the day, right? And so I think if we don't have that, or if the there's not that challenge at the table, how are they going to keep me honest at the end of the day and make sure that I'm doing the job I'm supposed to ultimately? Now our board is a little, I struggle with this question a little bit because our board is a little compromised a little bit differently or comprised a little differently, but for the typical kind of board relationship, I think that'd be the point I'd make.
Great. How about you, Erica?
Yeah, the one thing I'll add is I think not having that level of insight and expertise certainly will create blind spots because you don't have someone that, if you have a CISO role or a security team that's working diligently, right, to just help them in terms of making sure the strategy is focused on the right areas and holding them accountable. Otherwise, the security teams are in whack-a-mole mode. So you definitely need someone that has the ability to have the strategic view and input, has the experience, and they could help kind of guide, not necessarily make the decisions, but provide some level of accountability and resources for the teams. I think that's very critical. So it's the blind spots and then the strategic direction that's ultimately needed.
Great. So we talked a couple of times about expertise and maybe fake expertise. So in this scenario, what qualifies as an expert? And I'm going to expound upon that question a little bit because we've seen a number of things popping up of like a 2-day course or a 5-day course or something where a current board member can become a certified cybersecurity expert or some qualification for that. And the way that I think about it is, if I went to a 2-day or a 5-day course, could I then be considered a financial expert who could sit on a board and comply with Sarbanes-Oxley? And I think that the answer, of course, would be no. So what do you think qualifies as a cybersecurity expert? Obviously a CISO and years of experience, but what are some of the other things that you think might qualify for that? Alan, you want to start?
Well, I think almost every CIO that graduates out of that can easily be considered a cybersecurity expert for the purposes of a board, not for being a CISO and running a team,
right,
but for the board. And those courses you talk about, whether it's the NACD or Digital Directors Network or a few others that are popping up here and there, that course is likely sufficient for somebody that comes out of a technical background, already has some understanding, that can do this. But you're right, if somebody has been in a whole different specialty their entire career, and now they're a board member, a 1-day course is not sufficient to be the expert. It may make them cyber literate so that they can be a member of that committee and contribute. That committee likely still needs somebody that has a much stronger background.
Okay, Erica?
Yeah, I would agree 100%. I think everyone in this room that's here right now investing in their own cybersecurity knowledge probably could be a candidate in the future. So it's definitely going to open up some opportunities for cyber professionals that have a desire to sit on a board, I think, over time. But there is definitely going to be a shortage, I think, to start because the requirement is so vague. And so boards are probably going to scramble to figure out how do they make an existing member check the box, whether it's someone who's been in a CIO or that has overseen technology. But it'd be great over time if we see opportunities for true security professionals to step in and truly serve in the capacity because they have the experience and the knowledge.
Okay, Matt, what about you?
Yeah, I think experience, years of experience is number one, right? So, and I would agree, I don't know if it needs to be as a CISO, it could be C-level, it could be director level, honestly. I mean, I think as long as you have a very good understanding of, you know, what does the threat look like, right? How do we deal with that? What are the vulnerabilities? All the common stuff that we kind of all know inherently. People don't really get that. Or directors don't typically get that, right? And so you need somebody that can easily translate that stuff, right? So from sometimes very technical lingo into something that's business friendly and business, clear to the business and clearly articulates risk. So I'd say those softer skills, right, are going to be incredibly important to say, okay, I have enough knowledge and understanding of how the stuff is working and what's going on, but I can easily translate that to something that's meaningful to an executive that has no idea what we're talking about.
Yeah. So Alan, you talked a little bit about committees, and I know that there are some boards that actually have a cybersecurity committee today. Do you think that after this regulation comes to be, that there will be cybersecurity committees, or that will become more normalized in companies?
It might, but that'll probably first manifest in technology companies or companies that are in the cybersecurity business, where they would have that specialty. I think most boards will likely nest this function inside something similar to their audit and compliance committee, just because it's the easiest fit, because it has a lot of similarities with their audit requirements, their financial reporting, their compliance issues in whatever industry they're in. So it's a natural fit for starts. I think it'll be several years before it's ubiquitous that everybody has a separate standing cyber committee.
Yeah. Erica, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think there are many boards today that certainly have a component of technology ingrained, whether it's through the audit committee or there's a special subcommittee that's focused on technology investments. So it might be easy just to wrap cyber into one of the existing committees, but I do think that it's going to be important to raise the cyber risk to a level that it's not just kind of shuffled in with something else, so that there's enough time and attention given to it, and that's going to be critical. And it may take a special committee and some time to do that, but it's going to have that level of focus for sure.
Great. Matt?
Yeah, so just maybe give an example, right? So today we report out cybersecurity risk in our audit committee of the board. Actually, Monday was my last one, and so not last one, hopefully. I hope not last one.
Most recent.
The last one that
recent
occurred,
one, thank
right?
you. Most recent one. But honestly, we typically get 15 minutes max, right, to provide risk for a $6 billion nonprofit organization. And it's just not enough, right? And so what we've actually done is we've spent some time and developed a pre-meet schedule, right, of events. We meet with the audit committee chair for over an hour, typically, prior to the audit committee meeting, just to give additional detail, additional perspective, additional thoughts behind it. How are we thinking about dealing with things? What's important and relevant? What does she think is important and relevant to the committee? And those kinds of things. So that's been incredibly helpful. And so I can definitely see more of that kind of thing happening. Maybe it's either formal or informal, but ultimately formally reported out somewhere, right, in one of the existing committees or a new one.
So you mentioned that outside relationship with the head of the audit committee. What are you, the three of you, doing today as CISOs to kind of teach your board about cybersecurity in preparation for this? Is there anything that you're doing or that you would recommend that cyber professionals can do to help teach their boards or get their boards, as we said before, cyber literate at least? Is there something that you're doing? Erica, you want to start?
Yes. So while we have certain topics that we present on a regular cadence that they're interested in, one thing that we've started to incorporate is having what we're calling education sessions. So it's a special topic that you spend more time just diving deeper into to give them some understanding, right? It could be threat landscape, it could be identity stack, governance and policies, but it gives you time to focus specifically and dig in deep into some of the layers in cyber so that they can gain more of an understanding versus giving them the same packet of, okay, here's our top KRIs, here's our vulnerabilities, or here's the strategic projects we're working on. That's all great. That's truly static information that they want to hear about every time. But if you can spend time, giving them like a special session on a topic a couple times a year, I think that goes over well.
I like that, special learning sessions. Alan, what about you?
What she said. Just do that. Just find a way to get time with them and teach them your business. But you also have to translate some of your geek speak into business language. Make sure you do that. Don't expect them to learn your language totally, but do what Erica said.
Nice. Matt?
Ditto. But I would say, so again, just example, so we have lunch sessions in the board meetings. Those are typically special topic sessions that are available for various groups to provide updates and get into more detail. And everybody loves a good breach. Everybody loves a good story. And so if you're not a good storyteller, you need to work on that ultimately and build that storyline and how to articulate things. So one of the things I incorporate as an example into my every meeting that we do, we start out with a threat brief, right, of relevant incidents that have happened across the market or across the industry, not necessarily just healthcare. And ultimately, how does that impact what we're doing? And how do we consider that, or how do we think about that? And something that's going to be engaging for the audit committee members that are there. Which leads me to another thing is know your board members, right? And understand what are their backgrounds, what are the companies they're from, what are they looking for, what are the questions they're likely to ask ultimately, just to help prepare for some of that.
Great. So my last question for you all, before we have our audience members come up and ask us a few things. How can cybersecurity professionals today prepare themselves? Erica, you alluded to this a little bit before. Prepare themselves for when those opportunities come where public companies are looking for cybersecurity experts to sit on their board. How can you be ready? What are the things that you can do to learn about governance or whatever it is to get there? Erica, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, so the idea that comes to mind for me around this is, many of us start in a very technical space, or we kind of grow up through the ranks. Maybe we shift into management, or maybe you go down the path of, you get more of a technology background, certification or degree, and then you go get the MBA, right? I think boards are going to be looking for the cyber expert who has the business acumen, who can understand how cyber, as Alan mentioned, risk play into the full picture, and how to account for cyber throughout decision making. That's going to be very critical. So I think if cyber experts continue to stay on top of their own industry and having that knowledge, and they can bake in the business acumen, they'd be great candidates from my perspective.
Great. Alan, what do you think?
So I asked a peer of mine this exact question yesterday because I want to know the answer. Because I would love to have a paid board seat, and she's landed 2, and she is a CISO for a major company. And her advice to me was, network outside of our tribe. We're all a bunch of security folks. We're all professionals. We know each other. We've got these networks. You need to go network with the other specialties and companies, attend some of their sessions, and find a way to be on panels in those environments so you get to meet the CEOs, the CFOs, the COOs of different verticals too, not just the vertical you work in today, different verticals. And that's how you'll be better prepared and how you'll get an opportunity.
So business acumen, expand your network outside of cybersecurity. Matt?
I would say, so a couple things. One is, I went back to basics on my education, right? So my bachelor was in industrial technology. Grew up through IT and industrial technology and different kinds of things, right? So I've had a very technical background. Mm-hmm. I was missing the business acumen. So a few years ago, I went back, I got my MBA, right? BJC has a great benefit FYI, if anybody's looking for a job. But yeah, leverage that benefit, right? Of my company, got the MBA. That did help me really learn more about just traditional business acumen stuff that I needed to do, and focus on that. So I'd say definitely that, and just to reiterate what I think Alan said, it's a lot in who you know. I know there are services out there that you can put your name on boards and on a board list or whatever. That doesn't mean you're going to be picked. It doesn't mean that you're going to be, found.
Yeah,
I
there's
think
that scam one, right, that you have to pay them?
there's a lot of
Don't do
stuff
that.
out there that's ugly. But it is a lot in who you know, and ultimately how people know you and understand you and what your track record is, right? So you need to be authentic in everything you do, transparent in everything you do, and focus on those kinds of things ultimately. And eventually, you'll hopefully land something.
Now, I realize that I said that was the last question, but I'm gonna kind of follow up to that question. So, if I have the opportunity to be on a nonprofit board, is that something that will give me that experience? There's some organizations like the National Association of Corporate Directors. There's the Alan, you mentioned the Digital Directors Network, the Bob Zukas Group. You guys talked about doing an MBA and expanding your network, but what about some of those other things? Are those other good ways that people can learn about governance and be ready?
Yeah, I think it is, right? So I've been blessed to have the opportunity to be on a few boards, right? Autism Speaks is a personal passion of mine. So I've been on the executive leadership committee for them in the Midwest region. I'm also passionate about growing our next set of talent, and so I've been working with a lot of our local universities in Missouri, right, and doing computing advisory boards and things like that, right? So it's not all about the money, and it's not all about the focus on me, right? It's how can I ultimately give back and prepare. And I'm a firm believer that what I put in will maybe eventually come back to me, and that's great. And if not, I've helped some people along the way.
Yep. Now, Erica, before you answer, I just want to tell everybody that Erica and Alan and I are all on a nonprofit board together. But now go ahead and answer the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's critical. Nonprofit and advisory boards can provide you with the opportunity to just provide thought leadership and then just understand how boards operate. And many board members, before they land a paid board seat, 99% of the time have already served in some capacity in a way that they volunteered on a board. So I definitely think it's a great way to start kind of building that experience and showing that you have a vested interest in some organization or something, because it just sets you apart from someone that's just coming up in the ranks and does not have that experience.
Great. Alan, any last comments on that?
It's just not likely to hurt.
Right.
Will it be the thing that gets you selected for some highly paid board position in a Fortune 100 company? Probably not. But will it give you some exposure to the process and the terms that are used and the governance processes in play? Most definitely, yes, it will help in that sense. And you might meet some people that way and expand that network.
Right, going back to your networking thing. Okay, well, we've only got a few minutes left, folks, but we'd love to allow you to ask us some questions. I see somebody's already ready. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you for your time. Nat Heptessen, Deputy CSO for Lumen Technologies. We teed this up to our board last quarter, so I'm curious to know how you're thinking about the SEC ruling. It's very vague, obviously, but how are you considering the small non-material aggregate incidents, right? So the thing they talk about is there's the material you have to report out, but then the aggregation of the non-material, which is even more vague. So how are you planning through that?
Yeah, that's a real Monday morning quarterbacking setup moment when I read that, because you had 5, 6, 7, 8 things individually, didn't matter, but later on somebody says, oh, take all those together, you should have reported that. That is a little scary, that language. So I really hope they tighten that up in the final draft.
Great question.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay, we got a question over here.
Hi, I would love to hear the panelists talk, give us a real world anecdote of something you had to bring to the board, how you did it, what language you used, how you translated your techie speak into business speak. I'm thinking, say Log4j. I know a CISO who had 15 minutes, a couple of slides, to give to the board, and that was it. What's your own take on, like, how you dealt with the board over Log4j or a similar event of that magnitude? Thank
I
you.
think Matt started to talk a little bit about storytelling, right? And not using the tech lingo. One of the things that our board would always ask for is these stories in the news, right? What happened with Uber? Is that something that could happen to us? What are we doing to prevent that from happening to us? So I really think it's about storytelling and being able to talk about it in a way that doesn't have a bunch of acronyms and cyber speak in a way that someone who's not a cybersecurity expert would be able to understand it.
Yeah, I mean, so since it's so fresh and evidently it was my last board meeting. So I brought up the Silicon Valley Bank situation, right? Used that as an example and said, hey, while we don't and didn't do business there, what we did see was an increase in the business email compromise attempts that were going on, right? Bad actors were immediately on top of that, right? And trying to take advantage of, hey, change your routing number, change your banking number, all these things are happening, right? And we saw some of that, right? And so what I did was really articulate, hey, this is something everybody has seen in the news. And then ultimately tied it back to our metrics, what we actually saw in the previous quarter, how that impacted us, and then how we were dealing with that. And ultimately how our treasury teams and our accounts payable teams were dealing with it. And some success stories there where they identified some things and successfully got to it before it became an issue, right?
Anybody else?
Yeah, I would
talking to your
just
board?
double
We do
down.
have another question.
I was going to say double down on the storytelling, right? What's important? Why is it important? How does it impact the business or the organization you're with? And then what do you need from them in terms of support, whether it's, financial, further investments, just kind of having that theme and being able to do it succinctly and getting right to the point is the best way to approach it.
All right.
So this probably builds off a little bit of what Matt said in the first question as well, but as we think about quantitative metrics and reporting, do you anticipate a need for better record keeping even amongst the security operations team to demonstrate whether these are compounding trends or that kind of thing based on this guidance? And if so, how can the professionals here best prepare for something like that?
Great question. What do you guys think, quantitative?
I think the quick answer is yes, if you're not already doing it, right? So I think it's my belief every security program should have some key performance indicators, some key metrics that you're reporting on a consistent basis. And I'm not just talking about here's the number of vulnerabilities, right? It's it's different kinds of metrics that are meaningful, that are showing those trends ultimately. I think it's going to be very important to keep record of that and understand. So if we do get challenged in the future, we can go back and say, well, at the time, this is what we saw, this is what we understood, this is now what we understand, and here's how we've pivoted from that and what actions we've taken from that, from those learnings that we had before. So that's what comes to mind immediately.
And I think it's really important to remember the distinction between an output metric and an outcome metric. And the board doesn't care about output. A manager, maybe a director, they care because they're making sure the team's working properly. You've got to elevate these metrics and these measures up to the board as you go through your leadership stack. And you got to figure out where your board wants to be and where they need to be and find the happy medium and stick to that. If you get down into, well, analyst A can respond in 5 minutes, but analyst B takes 8 minutes, and you're briefing that to your board, you've lost. You got to stay at the right level.
Yep. Erica, anything from you?
Nothing more to add. I think those were great.
Okay. Well, listen, I'd like to get a round of applause for our esteemed panelists today and their views on SEC and cybersecurity expertise in the boardroom.